I remember the first time I saw the cabin, how the trees stood tall around it, thick and endless, the ground littered with dead leaves and damp earth. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of pine, wet wood, and something stale, like old dust settled into the cracks of forgotten things. The place had been in my family for decades, but no one ever used it anymore. My uncle had been the last one to stay there, and he never talked about it after he left. Just sold it to me cheap, said he was done with the whole idea of the woods. I liked the idea of being alone for a while. No people, no noise, just me and the quiet. I had things to figure out, and I thought the cabin would give me the space to do that. I packed up supplies, enough for weeks, and made the drive upstate, past the smaller towns, until the roads turned into dirt paths. I remember the sound of gravel crunching under the tires, the way the trees seemed to close in as I got closer. It felt like I was stepping into a different world, one that had been waiting for me to return. The cabin was small but solid. A single room with a stove, a bed, and a table with 2 chairs. A separate outhouse stood a few feet away, and there was a small shed filled with tools that had gone untouched for years. Everything smelled old, the kind of old that doesn't go away even when you open the windows. I spent the first day cleaning, shaking out blankets, wiping down counters, trying to make it feel like mine. The silence stretched out around me so thick it felt like it had weight. No hum of traffic, no voices, just the wind pushing through the trees. It was peaceful. At least that's what I told myself. The first few nights, I slept hard, the kind of sleep that comes when you're away from everything. But something changed on the 4th night. I woke up suddenly, with that strange feeling that someone had called my name, though I knew no one was around. The cabin was cold. The fire in the stove had burned low. I pulled the blankets around me and listened. The woods had their own sounds, twigs snapping, wind moving branches. But this was different. It was close, too close, a rustling near the shed, then silence. I told myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon, maybe a fox. I forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was soft from rain, and I noticed something strange near the shed. Footprints. Not boot prints, not paw prints. Bare feet. Human. The sight of them sent a chill through me. They weren't mine. I hadn't been outside barefoot. And they weren't old either. The edges were sharp, undisturbed by wind or rain. Whoever made them had been there last night. Watching. Listening. I locked the door that night. Stoked the fire until the room was warm. Sat in the chair with a knife in my lap. Listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. The rustling. Slow, deliberate. Then the sound of something scraping against wood. The shed door. My stomach tightened. I wanted to tell myself it was the wind, but I knew better. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the shed. The door was slightly open. I knew I had shut it before. Inside, things had been moved. An old saw, a hammer, a few nails scattered on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to know someone had been in there. Someone had been watching me. I told myself I'd leave, pack up, and go. But something in me wanted to know, wanted to see. I stayed one more night. That was my mistake. I sat up in bed, listening. The air was still, but I could feel something was wrong. Then a noise, not outside, inside. A slow, deliberate creak of floorboards. My heart pounded. I reached for the knife, gripping it tight. The fire had burned low, throwing shadows against the walls. I stayed still, barely breathing. Then I saw it. The slightest shift in the darkness near the door. A shape, someone standing there, silent, watching me. I didn't think. I moved fast, lunging forward with the knife. The shape ducked back, slamming against the doorframe before bolting outside. I ran after them, bare feet hitting the cold wood of the porch. The moon was out, casting pale light over the trees. I caught a glimpse of them, too fast to see details, just movement, the flash of skin before they disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep that night, didn't turn my back to the door. When morning came, I packed everything, threw it into the truck, and left without looking back. I don't know who they were. I don't know how long they had been watching me before I noticed. Maybe they had been there from the start. Maybe they had been there long before I arrived. All I know is that they were real, and they were close. Too close. I never went back to the cabin. I told my uncle to sell it, to burn it, to do whatever he wanted with it. I didn't care. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some silences aren't meant to be broken. I know that now. I never should have taken the job. The ad was vague, just like they always are. It promised good pay for simple work, caretaking an old hunting cabin for a few weeks while the owner was away. The guy on the phone barely gave me any details, just a date, an address, and a promise that everything I needed would be stocked inside. I didn't ask questions. I should have. The place was deep in the woods, miles from any real road. My truck struggled up the narrow dirt path, tires slipping on damp leaves. By the time I saw the cabin, it was nearly dark. It was an old thing, the kind of place that had seen decades of rough winters. Wooden walls dark with age, a sagging roof, a front porch littered with dead leaves. It looked abandoned. The guy had said it would be stocked, but when I went inside, I saw no food, no extra firewood, nothing. Just a bed, a wood stove, a single chair, and a small table with an old lantern on it. The walls had a few hunting trophies nailed up, deer antlers, faded pictures of men with rifles standing over their kills. The first night was uneventful, just me and the silence of the woods. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way the wind barely moved the trees, or the way the house creaked like someone shifting their weight when I lay down to sleep. The second day, I hiked around to get my bearings. The land was empty. No trails, no signs of anyone coming through in a long time. I found an old shed about 50 yards behind the cabin. The lock on the door was rusted, but the inside smelled of old blood and something worse. Animal skins were nailed up to dry, the fur curling at the edges. I told myself it was just hunting remains, but something was wrong with them. Some of the skins weren't deer or anything I could recognize. That night, I heard noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of the forest, branches shifting, leaves rustling. But it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Slow footsteps circling the cabin. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was my imagination. But the sound kept going, moving in steady loops around the house. Then it stopped, right outside the door. The handle moved. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the door, waiting. After what felt like hours, the sound moved away, back into the woods. The next morning, I checked outside. No footprints, nothing disturbed, but the door felt wrong, like it had been tested, pushed. I wanted to leave, but the truck wouldn't start. No cell service, of course. I had enough food for a few more days, but after that, I had no plan. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the window watching the woods. Around midnight, I saw movement. Something was out there, not an animal. It was too still, too patient. Then it moved closer. A man, or something shaped like one. His clothes were torn, his face obscured by shadow. He stood at the tree line, just watching. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a while, he stepped back into the woods. By morning, I was done. I took the rifle from above the fireplace, old but still loaded, and started walking. The truck was useless, but maybe I could hike out. I figured if I followed the road, I'd eventually hit another house or a main road. But I didn't make it far. Less than a mile in, I found something that stopped me cold. A house. No, not a house. Another cabin. Just like mine. Same sagging roof. Same single chair on the porch. Same everything. Like it had been copied and pasted into the woods. But it wasn't abandoned. Smoke curled from the chimney. The door was cracked open. I didn't go inside. I turned around, heart pounding, and walked back the way I came. But when I got back to my cabin, the door was wide open. And inside, the chair, the same chair I'd been sitting in all night, was knocked over. Someone had been inside. I locked the door and didn't sleep. I didn't even sit. I just stood in the corner, holding the rifle, waiting for the sun. At dawn, I left again. This time, I didn't stop walking. I ignored the second cabin. I ignored the sounds behind me, the feeling of eyes watching from the trees. I walked for hours, maybe longer, and then, just as the sun started to set, I saw something through the trees. A road. I ran. I ran harder than I ever have in my life. When I hit the pavement, I almost collapsed. A truck came by not long after. A hunter. He gave me a ride into town. I didn't tell him the full story, just that my truck had broken down, that I needed to get back home. I never called the guy who hired me, never asked for my pay. I just left. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I dream about that other cabin, the one just like mine, and I wonder if, somewhere deep in those woods, someone else is watching a house that looks just like theirs, and waiting. I took the trip alone. It wasn't supposed to be anything extreme, just a quiet weekend at a remote cabin in the woods. I needed a break from the noise of the city, from my job, from everything. The idea of solitude was something I had always enjoyed, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. A small, one-room cabin with a wood-burning stove, an old generator, and nothing but trees for miles. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long and uneventful. As I left the main road and turned onto a dirt path, I felt the shift in atmosphere immediately. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, and the road ahead was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and loose gravel. My car rocked over the bumps, but it handled the rough terrain well enough. The cabin itself was older than I expected. It was sturdy, but the wood showed signs of age, dark spots where water had seeped in, rusted nails protruding slightly from the planks. The front door stuck a little when I pushed it open, the hinges letting out a slow, groaning sound. Inside, it was simple. A small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch that sagged in the middle, and a bed pushed against the wall. There was an old wood stove in the corner and a pile of logs stacked neatly beside it. The first night was quiet. I built a fire, made a quick meal, and read a book by lantern light. The generator powered a single bulb in the ceiling, but I liked the dim, flickering glow of the lantern better. Felt more fitting. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in slow, rhythmic gusts. It was peaceful, isolating, but in a good way. The next morning, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and gnarled. The forest floor was soft with moss, and I could hear the sound of birds overhead. I walked for a while, breathing in the crisp air, enjoying the quiet. I didn't wander too far. I knew better than to get lost in an unfamiliar place. After about an hour, I turned back. When I reached the cabin, something felt off. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but there was a shift, a subtle difference that made my stomach tighten. The door was closed just as I had left it, the windows still locked from the inside. But as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were slightly smaller, the treads different from my boots. I hesitated, scanning the tree line, but there was no movement. The woods were still, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Maybe a hunter had passed through, someone from town. That had to be it. Still, my fingers tightened around the handle of the hatchet I had brought with me. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The rest of the day passed slowly. I kept an eye on the woods, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the footprints could have been there before and I had only just noticed. By nightfall, I almost believed it. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I lay still, barely breathing. Another crunch, closer this time. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The fire had burned low, casting only faint shadows along the walls. I reached for the lantern and flicked it on. The sound stopped immediately. The cabin was silent again, the only noise my own ragged breathing. I sat there for a long time, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe. I forced myself to sleep, but it was restless, my mind replaying the sound over and over. The next morning, I found more footprints. They were fresh, leading from the tree line to the edge of the cabin. They stopped just beneath the window. My window. I packed my things. Felt stupid, overreacting like this, but every instinct I had screamed at me to leave. I loaded my bag into the car, started the engine, and put it in reverse. As I glanced up at the cabin one last time, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A piece of rope, tied in a loop, hanging from a tree branch near the porch. It hadn't been there before. I didn't stay to find out more. I drove, faster than I should have, the road uneven beneath my tires. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, surrounded by other cars, by people. The weight in my chest finally lessened. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there watching, waiting, but I know one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. I never should have gone back to that cabin, but at the time I thought it would be peaceful, a good place to clear my head. I had taken a leave of absence from work, and I needed to be alone for a while. No emails, no calls, no noise. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The cabin had been in my family for years. It sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, the kind of place where no one could find you if you didn't want to be found. The first time I had stayed there alone, I was a kid. My father had taken me hunting, and we spent 3 days in the cold, chopping wood and telling stories by the fire. But this time I was alone, and the forest felt different. The trees seemed taller, the silence heavier. There was no distant hum of traffic, no birds chirping, nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees. I had driven up early in the morning. The road leading to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path, and my truck struggled over the rocks and roots that had grown into the road. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, I sat in the truck for a few minutes, staring at the place. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging slightly. The windows were covered in a thin layer of grime. It looked abandoned, almost forgotten. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and old wood. I opened the windows, letting the crisp autumn air push the mustiness out. I dropped my bag on the table and started unpacking. Canned food, bottled water, a hunting knife, a flashlight. I had enough supplies to last me a week. The first day passed uneventfully. I walked through the woods, took in the quiet, and made a small fire when the sun started setting. The night was cold, but the fire kept the cabin warm. I read a book by lantern light and fell asleep early. Then, in the middle of the night, something woke me. A sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the leaves around the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Then silence. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. Instead, I stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The trees swayed slightly, but I couldn't see anything. No movement, no shapes. I waited a few more minutes, then went back to bed, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. But my gut told me otherwise. I barely slept after that. Every little sound outside kept me awake, my ears straining for anything unusual. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. There were tracks in the dirt, human tracks. They circled the cabin once, then led off into the trees. My stomach tightened. I wasn't alone. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The tracks could have been old. Maybe some hunter had passed through days ago. Still, I locked the door when I went inside. That night, the noises came again. Footsteps, closer this time. I lay still in bed, gripping my hunting knife, listening. Then, a soft tapping at the window. Not knocking, just the sound of fingernails scratching against the glass. My chest tightened, my breathing slowed. I didn't move. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one window to the next. Whoever was out there was circling the cabin again. Then silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. When the sun came up, I checked outside again. More footprints, fresh ones. They stopped right at my window. My hands shook as I traced the tracks with my eyes. They led back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I was being watched. That day, I stayed inside, keeping my rifle close. I barely ate. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, staring at me. But I saw nothing, just the empty forest. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. I didn't know if it would do any good, but it made me feel a little safer. Then I sat by the window, rifle in hand, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of the doorknob turning. Slowly, quietly, someone was trying to open the door. I gripped the rifle tighter, my heart pounding. The knob turned again, more forcefully this time. Then silence. Whoever it was, they were still there. I knew it. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then the sound of footsteps again, moving away. The crunch of leaves, getting softer, fading into the night. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my bag. I wasn't staying another night. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. A knife stabbed into the wooden porch. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin behind me, and left. I didn't run, but I walked fast, my rifle gripped tight in my hands. As I drove away, I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if someone was watching me from the trees. I never went back to that cabin again. I never expected to find myself alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, with no cell service and no way to reach the outside world. But that's exactly where I was, and what happened there still keeps me awake at night. It wasn't ghosts, demons, or anything supernatural. It was something much worse, something real. I had planned the trip for months. After weeks of stress from work, I needed a break. No emails, no calls, just me, the woods, and the silence. The idea of staying in a cabin away from the city sounded perfect. I had found the place online. A small, rustic wooden cabin in the middle of nowhere, about a 4-hour drive from the nearest town. The listing described it as secluded and peaceful, perfect for a getaway. That's exactly what I was looking for. I booked it for a week. The drive up was uneventful. The farther I got from civilization, the more the roads narrowed. The last stretch was nothing but a dirt path, winding through thick trees. It was already late afternoon when I arrived. The cabin was small but sturdy looking, with a steep roof and a wraparound porch. There was no electricity, just an old generator out back and no running water, only a well with a manual pump. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. A fireplace stood in one corner, and a single bed with a thick wool blanket was pushed against the wall. A small kitchenette with a propane stove and a battered wooden table completed the place. I unpacked my supplies: canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, and my hunting knife, just in case. I planned to spend my days hiking and my nights reading by lantern light. That first night was peaceful. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I fell asleep quickly. The second night was when things started to feel wrong. It began with a noise, a faint rustling outside. At first, I ignored it. There were plenty of animals in the woods, raccoons, deer, maybe a fox. But then it happened again. A distinct crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I sat up in bed, listening. Nothing. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak. I told myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, making it easy to spot tracks. I expected to find deer prints. Instead, I found something else: footprints. Bare footprints. Human. They were fresh, leading from the tree line to the cabin's porch, then back into the woods. My stomach twisted. No one else was supposed to be out here. The nearest cabin was miles away. I stood there, staring at the prints, my breath clouding in the cold morning air. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker got lost? Maybe some local wandered too far from home? But then why approach the cabin and leave without knocking? I spent the rest of the day on edge. I tried to enjoy my hike, but every snap of a twig had me turning my head. I returned to the cabin before dark, locked the door, and kept my knife close. That night, the noises returned. The same rustling, the same crunching. But this time, it didn't stop. It circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath, gripping my knife so hard my knuckles turned white. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then something tapped against the window. A single, sharp tap. Then another. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping stopped. A long silence followed. Then, the footsteps retreated, vanishing into the woods. I barely slept. The first light, I checked outside. The footprints were back. Closer this time, right up to the window. I packed my bags, ready to leave. But when I tried to start my car, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking for. The battery was fine. Nothing seemed broken, but the car was dead. Panic set in. I was stranded. No phone service, no car, and someone, somewhere, was watching me. I spent the day trying to fix the engine, but I had no tools and no real knowledge of cars. As the sun set, I knew I had no choice but to spend another night in the cabin. I barricaded the door with the table, stacked logs in the fireplace, and kept my knife within reach. I sat in the chair by the fire, watching the flickering light. Hours passed. Then, just past midnight, I heard it, the sound of my car door opening. A cold wave of terror washed over me. I hadn't locked it. I hadn't thought I needed to. Then the trunk. A slow creak as it opened. I wanted to move, to look outside, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't listen. A few minutes passed. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, my knife clutched in my hand. When the first light crept through the trees, I forced myself outside. My car doors were shut, but something was wrong. The back seat was empty, but my bags had been rummaged through. My food was gone. My water, too, but nothing else. My keys still in the ignition. The engine still wouldn't start. I had no choice but to walk. I packed what little I had left, slung my bag over my shoulder, and set out. The hike to the main road was at least 15 miles. I didn't look back. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my breath ragged. The forest was silent, too silent. I felt watched, like something was moving just beyond my vision, keeping pace with me. I pushed forward. By the time I reached the road, the sun was setting. My legs were numb, my feet blistered. I kept walking, following the road, hoping for a passing car. After what felt like an eternity, one appeared in the distance. I waved it down, nearly collapsing as the driver stopped. He was a local, an older man with a weathered face. He didn't ask many questions, just gave me a ride into town. At the police station, I told them everything. They sent a deputy out to check the cabin. When they returned, they found my car exactly as I'd left it. But there was something else. Footprints, dozens of them, surrounding the cabin, leading into the woods. Some were old, some fresh, and some were smaller, child-sized. They never found who it was. I never went back. Even now, in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there, someone is still watching, waiting, and that they know exactly where to find me. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would rent a cabin alone in the woods, but there I was. I had been working long hours at my job, drowning in stress, and I needed a break from everything. Phones, emails, people. I wanted solitude, so I found a remote cabin through a rental site. It was far from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees, with no cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. A week of complete isolation. The drive took longer than expected. The roads got narrower the deeper I went into the woods, twisting through dense forest. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour when I finally spotted the turnoff. A narrow dirt path led me to the cabin, a small, weathered structure sitting alone in a clearing. It had a porch, a single chimney, and a small shed off to the side. The sun was starting to set behind the trees when I parked the car and stepped out. I went inside and looked around. It was simple. A living room with an old couch and a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom with a creaky wooden bed. It smelled like old wood and dust, but it was clean enough. The rental listing had mentioned a generator since there was no power out here. I found it behind the cabin, cranked it on, and the lights flickered to life. The hum of the generator filled the silence of the woods. I unpacked my things, made a quick meal, and settled in for the night. I felt good about my decision. The stillness was calming, and I let myself relax for the first time in months. But by the second night, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things that didn't seem right. The first thing I noticed was the door to the shed. When I arrived, the shed door had been slightly open. I remembered closing it when I went out to check the generator. But the next morning, it was open again, just a crack. I figured maybe the wind had pushed it open, even though there hadn't been much wind. I shut it again and moved on. Later that day, I went for a short walk around the property. The forest was thick, but there were faint trails leading deeper into the woods. The further I walked, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was unsettling. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, like footsteps crunching on leaves. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, but something about it didn't feel right. I stayed awake for a long time before finally drifting back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints in the dirt, leading from the woods to the cabin. They stopped right at my front door. My first thought was that maybe someone had come to check on me, but that didn't make sense. The rental owner had told me no one else would be around. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling in my gut. I checked around the cabin. Nothing was missing. The shed door was closed this time, but when I looked inside, I noticed something odd. A dusty old axe was missing from the wall. There had been a spot where tools were hanging, and I could see the outline where the axe had once been. I searched the area but didn't find it. Maybe the owner had taken it, I told myself, though I didn't fully believe it. By the fourth day, I was on edge. I kept hearing faint noises at night, soft scraping sounds near the walls, twigs snapping in the distance. I locked the doors and windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I sat in the living room, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving outside. I turned off the lights and peeked through the window. Nothing. The woods were pitch black. The generator hummed in the background, masking any small noises. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something to move. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, motionless, just standing there watching the cabin. My stomach twisted into knots. It was too dark to see any details, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there. They didn't move. They just stood there. I couldn't tell if they were facing me, but I felt their gaze locked onto me. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fireplace poker, and moved toward the bedroom, locking myself inside. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jump. I waited for the morning, counting down the hours until daylight. When the sun finally came up, I cautiously stepped outside. The figure was gone, but the footprints remained. They led from the tree line to the side of the cabin, stopping just beneath my bedroom window. Someone had been standing there, right outside while I was inside, listening, waiting. I decided I had enough. I packed my things in record time and got ready to leave. But when I went to start my car, my stomach dropped. The hood was open. Someone had tampered with the engine. Wires were cut, and the battery was missing. I was stranded. Panic set in. I had no way to call for help, no way to drive out. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no idea if the person or people who had been outside my cabin were still watching me. I had to think fast. I remembered the generator. It had a small gas supply. I grabbed a can from the shed and took off on foot. I had seen a ranger station on the way in about 5 miles down the road. If I could make it there, I could call for help. I moved quickly, checking over my shoulder constantly. The woods felt suffocating. Every sound made my skin crawl. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching, the canister feeling heavier with each step. Then I saw it, the ranger station up ahead. But something was wrong. The door was wide open. The inside was dark. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I needed help. I stepped inside. The place had been trashed. Papers scattered, chairs overturned. And then, on the wall, scratched into the wood, I saw a message. "They watch from the trees." I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the road. The sun was setting, and I knew I couldn't be caught outside after dark. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. A truck. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms. The truck slowed. A man rolled down his window. "You okay?" I barely got the words out. "Someone's out here." "They, my car, ranger station." He nodded. "Get in." I didn't hesitate. I climbed in and we drove off. I glanced back once, just as we rounded a bend, and I saw them. Several figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching, unmoving. Dozens of them. I never looked back again. I never went back to that cabin. And I never, ever went into the woods alone again. I woke up to the sound of something scratching against wood. It wasn't a dream, I was sure of that. The noise was real, coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be an animal. The woods around my cabin were full of raccoons, deer, even the occasional bear. But something about the sound didn't sit right with me. It was too slow, too deliberate, like someone dragging their nails across the wooden walls. I held my breath and listened. The scratching stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and heavy. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the wind or some stray branch brushing against the cabin. But then it started again, this time on the window. A long, slow scrape against the glass. I stayed completely still in bed, barely breathing. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The window was right next to me, covered only by thin curtains that did nothing to block out the outside. If I moved too much, whoever or whatever was out there might notice. The scratching continued for what felt like forever, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was doing it was trying to get my attention. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. Nothing, just the sound of the wind in the trees, the distant call of some night bird. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I forced myself to check the window. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the glass. Long, jagged scratch marks ran across the surface, deep enough that I could feel them when I ran my fingers over them. My stomach twisted. I stepped outside and checked the wooden walls of the cabin. More scratches. Some were light, just surface marks, but others were deep, gouging into the wood like something sharp had been dragged across it. I told myself it had to be an animal. A bear, maybe, though I'd never seen one act like that before. I checked for tracks but found nothing. The ground was dry, covered in a layer of dead leaves, making it impossible to tell if anything had been there. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the unease. I chopped wood, checked my food supplies, and kept myself busy. But every time I looked at those scratches, I felt a cold pit of dread settle in my stomach. Something wasn't right. That night, I locked every door and window. I even pushed a heavy chair in front of the door, just in case. I told myself it was over. Whatever had been out there was gone. I was wrong. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was deep, slow, and too close. My whole body went rigid. The breathing was right outside the window. I could hear it through the thin glass, steady and deliberate, like someone standing inches away. I didn't move, didn't even blink. The breathing continued, unhurried. Then a soft tap against the glass. Just once. Then another, and another. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone testing the glass, seeing if it would break. I couldn't move. My body refused to respond. The tapping continued, slow and patient. And then, just as suddenly as before, it stopped. I lay awake the rest of the night, eyes locked on the window, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, I went outside to check. The scratches were still there, but this time there were footprints beneath the window. Not animal prints, human, barefoot, deep in the dirt. Someone had been standing there for hours, watching me sleep. I felt sick. My cabin was miles away from the nearest road, deep in the woods. No one came out here. No one should have been out here. I packed my things, deciding I needed to leave. But as I threw my bag over my shoulder, something caught my eye. A piece of fabric, snagged on a nail by the window. It was old, dirty, but definitely from a piece of clothing. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching me. I locked up the cabin and hiked back to my truck, parked a mile away down a dirt road. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. When I finally reached my truck, I almost cried in relief. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the trees, barefoot, watching me drive away. I never went back to that cabin. I had been driving for hours, longer than I should have, but I wanted to put some distance between myself and the city before nightfall. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, just outside a place barely mentioned on a map. It seemed perfect, isolated, quiet, a place where no one would bother me. That was exactly what I needed. The last stretch of the drive was rough. The paved road ended, and the rest was nothing more than a dirt path barely wide enough for my truck. Trees crowded in from both sides, their twisted branches reaching overhead, blocking out what little light remained in the sky. My headlights caught the occasional reflection of an animal's eyes in the darkness, but otherwise, the road was empty. I kept going, my tires crunching against gravel and dried leaves until I finally saw the cabin at the end of the path. It was smaller than I had expected, but that didn't matter. It had 4 walls, a roof, and a door that locked. That was all I needed. The exterior was old but sturdy, built from thick logs that had darkened with age. There was a single window facing the front, its glass reflecting the trees behind me. A wooden porch wrapped around one side, leading to the entrance. There were no signs of life, no tire tracks, no footprints in the dirt. Just silence and the weight of the forest pressing in around me. I parked beside the cabin and cut the engine. The sudden quiet was unnerving, a sharp contrast to the hours of background noise I had grown used to on the drive. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of an insect. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and stepped out, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The air smelled of pine and decaying leaves, heavy and still. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a bed pushed against one wall, a small wood-burning stove in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs. A doorway led to a tiny bathroom with an old, stained sink and a toilet that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The only light came from an oil lamp sitting on the table, its glass cloudy with soot. I set my bag down and turned the lamp's knob, watching as the small flame flickered to life. There was no electricity, no running water, just the bare essentials. That was fine. I had prepared for this. I had enough food and water to last a week, and I wasn't here for comfort. I was here to be alone, to think, to get away from everything. I had spent too long in places where people always needed something from me, where I was constantly surrounded by noise. This was my escape. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows, making sure they were secure. Then, I sat at the table, eating a meal from a can, listening to the sounds of the woods outside. The wind picked up, making the trees groan and creak. Something scurried across the roof, its tiny claws scratching against the wood. Probably a squirrel, maybe a raccoon. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was safe here. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper against the wind. A rustling in the leaves, the snap of a twig. Then a heavy footstep, slow, deliberate, close. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I strained to listen, but the wind made it impossible to tell where the sound had come from. Another step, closer now, just outside the window. I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the glass. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But I knew I had heard something. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. I moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. My breath felt too loud in my chest. I reached out, pressed my fingers against the glass, and peered outside. Nothing, just trees, just darkness. Then the sound came again. Not outside, inside, behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The cabin was empty. The door was still locked. The windows were shut, but something had moved. I was sure of it. I grabbed the oil lamp, lifting it higher, casting flickering shadows across the walls. My bag sat where I had left it. The bed was untouched. The bathroom door stood open, revealing the small, empty space inside. I wasn't alone. The feeling was overwhelming, a deep, primal instinct screaming at me. I turned in slow circles, searching for anything out of place. I checked under the bed, inside the tiny closet, behind the stove. Nothing. Then why did I still feel like I was being watched? The wind howled outside, shaking the walls. I forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe I was just on edge. Maybe the isolation was already getting to me. I had spent too long surrounded by people, by constant noise. Now, in the silence, my mind was playing tricks on me. I sat back down, forcing myself to eat, to focus on something other than the feeling crawling up my spine. The sound didn't come again, but the feeling never left. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me sit up, my ears straining in the darkness. I kept the lamp burning low, afraid of what I might see if I let the cabin go completely dark. My knife rested on the table beside me, within reach, just in case. Morning came slowly. The first light crept through the trees, pushing back the shadows. The unease from the night before still clung to me, but I told myself it was just nerves. I had wanted isolation. I had gotten it, but I wasn't alone. The next few days were worse. The feeling never left. I would hear things moving outside at night, too heavy to be an animal, too slow to be the wind. Footsteps circled the cabin, stopping just beneath the windows. I never saw anything, never found any tracks, but I knew something or someone was out there. By the fourth night, I had had enough. I packed my things, loaded my truck, and started down the narrow dirt road. The trees pressed in around me, their shadows long in the fading light. Then, in my rearview mirror, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, too far to make out a face, but close enough to know it was watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove, faster than I should have, pushing my truck harder than was safe. I didn't breathe properly until I hit the main road, until the trees thinned and the sky opened up above me. I never went back. I never told anyone. But sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night, I still feel it, that presence, watching. I never liked the idea of spending time alone in the woods. I wasn't the kind of person who romanticized cabins, campfires, or the silence of nature. But when my friend Mark offered me his family's remote hunting cabin for the weekend, I took it. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. Life in the city had become suffocating. Work stress, a breakup, and just the general noise of it all. I thought a weekend away from everything might help clear my head. The drive up took longer than expected. The directions Mark gave me were clear, but the roads were rough, unpaved dirt trails that seemed barely used. My tires kicked up dust that clung to my windows. I lost cell service miles before I reached the cabin. When I finally pulled up, I wasn't impressed. The cabin was small, old, and clearly neglected. The wooden structure was gray with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dusty, the front steps were warped, and the door had deep scratches on it. I told myself it was probably just from an animal. Inside, it was no better. The place smelled like damp wood and dust. A small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a living space with a stone fireplace. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps. Water came from a well outside, and the toilet was an outhouse behind the cabin. I wasn't planning to stay long, just 2 nights. I dropped my bag on the creaky bed, set up my sleeping bag, and went to gather firewood before it got dark. The forest was dense, the trees packed tightly together. As I walked, the silence became overwhelming. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps. The stillness felt unnatural. I tried to ignore it, focused on collecting wood. When I turned back toward the cabin, I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me. By the time I got back, the sun was setting. I lit a fire in the fireplace and heated up a can of soup. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't paranoia, it was something deeper. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something looking in. But there was nothing. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. The bed was stiff, and the blankets smelled musty. The wind picked up outside, making the old wood creak. Then I heard something else. A sound I couldn't immediately place. It was distant at first, but it got closer. A steady, rhythmic crunching. Footsteps on the dry leaves outside. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the cabin. Then scratching. Slow, deliberate. It moved along the side of the cabin, dragging across the wood. My heart pounded. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that, don't scrape their claws or whatever it was so methodically. I reached for my flashlight, but I hesitated before turning it on. If there was something or someone out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. I gripped the flashlight tightly, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, the doorknob rattled. I sat up straight, heart hammering. The rattling was slow at first, then more forceful. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, listening, waiting. Finally, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I forced myself to lie back down, though sleep never came. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The moment the sun rose, I stepped outside. There were footprints in the dirt, large human footprints. They led from the forest to my door, then around the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I told myself it was just some local messing with me, but deep down, I knew better. The tracks didn't lead from anywhere, just from the trees, as if whoever made them had been standing there, waiting, watching. I wanted to leave, but I forced myself to stay. It was broad daylight, and I didn't want to let my fear get the better of me. I spent the day chopping wood, keeping busy, but every so often I would stop and listen. The woods were too quiet. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and kept my flashlight in hand. I lay in bed, waiting. Around midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps, but this time they didn't stop at the cabin. They circled, slow, steady. I gripped the flashlight so hard my hand ached. Then, a new sound, tapping on the window. A single, deliberate tap. Then another. I couldn't move. My entire body locked up. The tapping moved to the other window. Then the next. Then the doorknob. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. My heart slammed against my ribs. Then I heard something worse than all of it. A whisper. Low, barely audible, just outside the door. It was my name. I don't know how long it lasted. The whispering, the footsteps, the tapping. Felt like hours. But eventually it stopped. At first light, I grabbed my bag, got in my car, and drove. I didn't look back. When I finally got back to town and told Mark, he looked pale. He told me something I didn't want to hear. His family had stopped using that cabin years ago because his uncle had gone missing there. They had searched for days, but he was never found. The only thing they did find was his truck, still parked outside, and a set of footprints leading into the woods. And in the dirt near the cabin, his name scratched into the wood of the door. I never went back. I never will. I took the cabin because I needed to get away. Life had been too much lately, work, the city, the constant noise. I told myself I needed a break, somewhere quiet, somewhere remote. The cabin was a last-minute find, deep in the woods, far from anything that could remind me of my daily life. The pictures online showed a simple wooden structure, a fireplace, a lake nearby. It looked perfect. The drive out was long. The roads narrowed, the trees thickened, and eventually, I found myself on a dirt path that wound through dense forest. The cabin was isolated, exactly what I wanted. No neighbors, no traffic, no streetlights, just trees, wind, and silence. I arrived in the afternoon, the sun low but still warm. The cabin was smaller than it looked in pictures, but that was fine. One room with a bed against the wall, a fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom with a rust-stained sink. The wood smelled old, like damp earth and time. I dropped my bags, walked outside, and took a deep breath. The air was thick with pine and the scent of the lake. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. I spent the rest of the evening settling in. I lit a fire, made a simple meal, sat by the window and watched the sky darken. The forest was alive with sounds. Branches shifting, something moving through the undergrowth, the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. That night, I woke up to a noise, a thump, not far outside the cabin. I lay still, heart hammering. Another thump, then silence. The fire had burned low, shadows flickering across the wooden walls. I strained to hear, but nothing else came. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. Something harmless. I pulled the blanket tighter and forced myself back to sleep. Morning came with an eerie quiet. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muted. I stepped outside, stretching, and noticed something strange. The dirt outside the cabin had been disturbed. Tracks. Not deep enough for boots, not quite the right shape for animal prints either. Just indentations, like something heavy had been pressed into the earth. I felt uneasy but told myself it was nothing. I had come here to relax, not to let my mind play tricks on me. The day passed in quiet routine. I explored the area a little, walked down to the lake, skipped stones across the surface. The water was still, reflecting the sky in perfect clarity. There were no other cabins, no boats, no people. Just me and the trees and the vast stretch of water. That night, the noises came again. This time, they were closer. A soft scrape against the wood of the cabin. Then another. My breath caught. I lay frozen, listening. The sound moved, slow, deliberate. Something outside, circling. I clenched my fists, waiting. Then silence. I forced myself to stay still, to breathe. It had to be an animal. A raccoon, maybe. Nothing dangerous. Still, I barely slept. By morning, I was exhausted. I stepped outside and my stomach dropped. More tracks. This time, clearer. They weren't animal prints. They weren't boot prints. They were just marks. Shapes pressed into the dirt, leading from the trees, stopping right outside my window. Then gone, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I told myself to leave. My gut screamed at me to go. But I had paid for the week. I had driven all the way out here, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who's scared easily. So I stayed. That night, the noises came earlier. A soft drag against the door. A faint creak of wood. I gripped the blanket, heart pounding. I had locked the door. I had checked it twice. But the sound didn't stop. It was inside the walls now, like something shifting just beneath the surface. My hands shook. I wanted to move, to grab something, anything, but I couldn't. Then it stopped. Silence. The cabin felt too small, too dark. My mind ran through every possibility, but nothing made sense. The next day, I packed my things. I told myself I was being irrational, that I was overthinking, but my body knew better. I needed to leave. I loaded my bags, stepped outside, and froze. The tracks weren't just at my window now. They were everywhere. The ground was covered in them, overlapping, crisscrossing, leading from the woods around the cabin back again. I didn't think. I just ran to my car, threw my bags inside, and started the engine. The tires spun in the dirt before catching. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat in the clearing, small, empty. But something was in the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. A shape, still watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't look again. The drive back felt longer. The forest stretched on, the road winding endlessly. When I finally saw the first signs of town, my body unclenched. I checked into a motel, locked the door, and sat awake until sunrise. I never went back. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear it. The sound of something dragging against wood, slow and deliberate, and I wonder how close it really got. I never wanted to be up here alone. The idea of a weekend away in the mountains sounded good at first, but by the time I made it up the winding road to the old cabin, I regretted every decision that had led me here. The cabin belonged to my uncle, a man I hadn't seen in years. He'd left it to me after he died. I wasn't particularly close to him, but free property is free property, and I thought maybe I could fix it up, rent it out, or even sell it for a good profit. I didn't know what condition it was in. I had never been up here before. I figured I'd spend a few days taking inventory of what needed to be done. Maybe clear out some of his old things, then head back home before the loneliness got to me. Getting there was already a hassle. The road was barely a road, more like a dirt path that had been carved out years ago and forgotten. My truck's tires kicked up dust and loose gravel as I drove, the occasional pothole making me grip the wheel tighter. The sun had started to dip below the tree line by the time I arrived, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I expected, a simple one-story structure made of old, darkened wood. The windows were covered in grime, and the front porch sagged slightly in the middle. It was obvious no one had been here in years. The air was cool and the scent of pine was thick, but there was something else, too. Something that made me uneasy. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the way the trees seemed too close, almost as if they had grown toward the cabin instead of around it. I pushed the front door open, and it creaked loudly, protesting after years of disuse. Inside, dust coated everything. A small kitchen sat to the left, barely big enough for one person. A fireplace with a few logs stacked beside it was against the far wall. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. That was it. I set my bag down and walked through the space, checking the cabinets and drawers. Most were empty, except for a few rusted tools and an old can opener. The bedroom was just a mattress on a frame, the sheets stiff with age. The bathroom had a cracked mirror and a sink that barely dripped when I turned the faucet. The place was old, but it wasn't unlivable. With a little work, I could make something of it. I spent the next few hours cleaning as best I could, wiping down surfaces, shaking out dust-covered sheets, and sweeping the floor. I found an old lantern in a cabinet and lit it, casting a flickering glow around the room. There was no electricity, so I relied on my phone's flashlight when I needed extra light. By the time I was done, it was fully dark outside. The only sound was the wind through the trees, a low whisper that never seemed to stop. I wasn't hungry, but I forced myself to eat a granola bar before lying down on the musty mattress. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside made me tense. I reminded myself that I was alone. There was nothing out there, but then I heard it. A single, deliberate footstep outside. I held my breath. My mind raced. Could be an animal, a deer, maybe even a bear, but the sound had been too distinct, too heavy. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The lantern on the nightstand flickered slightly, casting shadows along the walls. I reached for my phone, careful not to make a sound, and turned on the flashlight. I moved toward the window, keeping my steps light. The glass was streaked with dirt, but I could still see out into the yard. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I exhaled, letting myself relax. Then, another sound, this time from inside the cabin. It was faint, a soft scrape, like something dragging against wood. My blood turned to ice. I turned, scanning the room with my flashlight. The door to the hallway was open, just as I had left it. But something felt different. The air seemed heavier. I took a cautious step forward, my socked feet silent against the wooden floor. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. My eyes darted toward the kitchen. The cabinet door under the sink was open. I was sure it had been closed before. I swallowed hard. There was no way someone had gotten in. I had locked the door. The windows were shut. Still, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a rusted fire poker leaning against the wall. I held it tight, moving slowly toward the open cabinet. My breath came in shallow gasps. I crouched, flashlight aimed into the darkness of the space beneath the sink. Empty. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. Maybe I had just forgotten to close it. I turned, ready to go back to bed. And then I saw them. Footprints. Wet, muddy footprints leading from the doorway to where I stood. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard anyone come inside. But the prints were there, leading straight to me, and there was one more step. A single, fresh footprint right between mine. I ran, out the door, into the cold night, my breath coming in gasps. I didn't stop to grab anything. I didn't look back. I sprinted to my truck, yanked the door open, and locked it behind me. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition, my foot slamming the pedal. The tires spun on the dirt, then caught, propelling me forward. I didn't stop until I reached town. I never went back to that cabin. I put it up for sale, never even went to collect my things. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about fixing it up, because someone had been in there with me, and they had been close enough to touch me. I don't know how long they had been there. I don't know how they got in, but I know one thing: they never left. I had been driving for hours, heading deep into the thick woods of northern Montana. The road turned from paved to gravel, then to a narrow dirt path lined with trees so dense they swallowed the last bits of sunlight. The rental car's tires crunched over loose stones as I pushed forward, following the GPS instructions to the isolated cabin I had booked for the week. The idea was simple: get away from everything. No distractions, no people, just me and the quiet. I needed the break. Life in the city had worn me down, and the thought of a week with no emails, no traffic, and no stress seemed perfect. The listing had described the cabin as off-grid but fully stocked. There was a generator for power, a wood stove for heat, and a small stream nearby for water. It was remote, but that was part of the appeal. I had imagined spending my days hiking, chopping wood, maybe even fishing. Nights would be spent reading by the fire, sipping whiskey, enjoying the silence. By the time I arrived, the sun was gone, leaving behind only a dim glow in the sky. The cabin sat in a small clearing, a squat structure made of dark logs, a metal chimney rising from its roof, a wooden porch wrapped around the front, its planks old and slightly warped. There were no neighboring houses, no signs of life except for the occasional rustling in the trees. The GPS lost signal a while back, leaving me completely cut off. I grabbed my bag, stepped onto the porch, and unlocked the door. Inside, the air smelled of aged wood and dust, a slightly damp scent lingering from the last rainfall. The single-room cabin was simple: bed in one corner, a fireplace in the other, a small kitchen against the far wall. A wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the window, and a single oil lamp rested on the counter. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just silence. Felt peaceful. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking my food, stacking some logs by the stove. I started a fire, the warmth spreading quickly through the small space. Everything felt just as I had hoped: calm, quiet. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind whispering through the trees. But as I sat there, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a nagging feeling, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I chalked it up to city paranoia and ignored it. I had spent too many years surrounded by people, and maybe my brain just wasn't used to this kind of isolation. That night, I lay in bed listening to the wind. I had expected complete silence, but the forest was alive with noise. Branches swaying, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. I reminded myself that I was in the woods, miles away from civilization. It was normal. I forced myself to relax, eventually drifting off. I woke to a noise. Not the wind, not an animal. Something else. A slow, deliberate creaking, like someone stepping onto the porch. I held my breath, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak orange light across the room. The creaking stopped. I sat up, heart pounding. I told myself it was just the wood shifting, the cabin adjusting to the temperature change. I stayed still for what felt like hours, waiting for another sound, but there was nothing. Eventually, I lay back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I went outside. The porch was empty, no footprints in the dirt, nothing out of place. It had to have been my imagination. Still, the unease stayed with me. I spent the day chopping wood, trying to shake the feeling. The physical labor helped, the repetitive motion clearing my mind. But as the sun began to set, the unease returned. That night, I locked the door and checked the windows twice. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin groan. I sat by the fire with a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the window, scanning the darkness outside. Then I heard it again, a creak on the porch. My stomach tightened. I set my book down slowly, barely breathing. The sound came again, another step. Someone was out there. I reached for the hatchet I had brought inside, gripping the handle with sweating hands. The fire crackled, masking any other noises. I waited, heart hammering. Minutes passed. Nothing. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I crept toward the window. The glass was fogged from the warmth inside, but I could still make out the porch. Empty. The steps leading down into the trees were barely visible in the darkness. If someone had been there, they were gone now. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something, soft rustling, faint snapping of twigs. The woods were alive, but it felt wrong, like something was watching. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed my things, ready to leave. This was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stepped outside, locking the cabin behind me, and made my way to the car. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They led from the trees to the porch and then away again, disappearing into the dense woods. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been out here, watching. I didn't hesitate. I threw my bag into the car and started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It sat there, quiet, unchanged. But I knew I had made the right decision. Whatever had been watching me, whoever had been there at night, they weren't planning on stopping. I drove away, leaving the cabin behind, knowing I would never come back. I had never been the type of person to run away from my problems, but at that point in my life, I needed to get away. My job had drained me. My personal life was a mess, and I had been waking up every day with a headache that felt like it was crushing my skull. The stress was unbearable, and I figured some time alone in a quiet place would help clear my head. I found a listing for a cabin deep in the woods, about 3 hours away from the city. It was cheap, probably because it wasn't some luxury getaway. It was isolated, no running water, and the description made it clear that if you needed help, you'd be on your own. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for comfort. I just wanted silence, fresh air, and to be away from everything. The drive there was long and uneventful. Once I left the highway, it was just miles and miles of thick forest on either side. The road narrowed until it was barely wide enough for my car. After a while, the trees grew so close together that they blocked out most of the sky, making it feel like I was driving into a tunnel. I kept checking my phone's GPS, but the signal had dropped at some point, leaving me to rely on the directions I had written down. The cabin appeared suddenly at the end of the dirt road. It was smaller than I expected, barely more than a single room with a slanted roof. The wood was aged, gray from years of exposure. There was a fire pit outside, a pile of logs stacked neatly beside it, and a small outhouse about 20 feet away. A single window faced the front, dark and empty. It looked abandoned, but the key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under a loose stone near the door. Inside, the air was stale. Dust clung to every surface, and the floor creaked under my weight. There was a cot pushed against one wall, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a tiny table with a single chair. I set my bag down and checked my phone. No signal. I expected that, but it still made me uneasy. I spent the first couple of hours settling in. I swept the floor, wiped down the surfaces, and opened the window to let some fresh air in. The silence was overwhelming. I could hear nothing but my own movements and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity, just emptiness. It was peaceful in a way, but it also made me feel exposed. As the sun started to set, I went outside to gather firewood. The temperature had dropped, and the woods felt different in the fading light. I tried not to let it get to me, but something about being so far from civilization started to gnaw at the back of my mind. Still, I pushed the feeling aside and focused on the fire. I had brought enough food for a few days, cans of soup, some protein bars, and bottled water. Simple, easy, and nothing that needed refrigeration. The first night was uneventful. I listened to the crackling fire and stared up at the ceiling, my mind drifting. I had expected my thoughts to race, but instead, there was only emptiness, a dull, heavy exhaustion that kept me from thinking too much. I fell asleep quickly. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up, and I had no idea why. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Then I heard it, something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow, and close. I held my breath and strained to hear more. There was a shuffling sound, the soft crunch of leaves, then nothing. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was watching me. I stayed awake for hours listening, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off again. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked around the cabin. There were no signs of anything unusual, no footprints, no disturbances. The forest was still and quiet. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that my mind had turned normal forest noises into something sinister, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I spent the day hiking around the area, trying to push the paranoia away. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, their trunks thick and gnarled. I followed a narrow deer trail for a while, but eventually, I lost track of it and had to rely on my sense of direction to get back. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping low, and the air had turned cold again. That night, I made sure the fire was strong before I lay down. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. But once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, there was no slow shuffling. There was a clear, distinct sound. A knock. 3 soft, deliberate knocks against the cabin wall. I froze. My breathing was shallow, my body rigid. I listened, waiting. The silence stretched on. Then another knock, this time closer to the door. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, pointing it at the window. The light reflected off the glass, showing nothing but my own pale face staring back. I sat up, heart hammering, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached. I waited. The knocking didn't come again. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again. Still no signs of anything, but the feeling of being watched was worse. It was like an invisible weight pressing down on me. I knew I needed to leave. Whatever sense of peace I had hoped to find here was gone. I packed my things quickly, threw them into my car, and started the engine. But when I looked up at the tree line, I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the trees, motionless. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it was watching me. My stomach dropped. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I threw the car into reverse and sped down the dirt road, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, surrounded by the familiar signs of civilization. I never found out who or what was out there. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I will never go back. I had no reason to be out there alone. That thought ran through my head over and over again as I sat in the small wooden cabin, listening to the wind press against the walls, making the old wooden beams groan like a tired animal. It was supposed to be a getaway, a break from the city, from my job, from people. I had rented this place because it was cheap, remote, and didn't come with the distractions of Wi-Fi or cell service. That had sounded perfect at the time. Now, sitting here in the dim light of an old oil lamp, it felt like a mistake. A bad one. The drive up had already been a warning. The road was long and winding, cutting through thick trees that felt like they were closing in the further I went. The dirt path leading to the cabin had barely looked like a road at all, just a gap in the trees. I had to drive slow, the tires slipping in the soft mud left behind by the recent rain. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I had a bad feeling in my stomach. It was small, just a single story with a slanted tin roof and a porch that looked ready to collapse under its own weight. The windows were old, the glass wavy and dirty. The whole place looked forgotten. Inside wasn't much better. The air was thick with dust. The wooden floorboards had deep scratches, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The main room had a small table with 2 chairs, a couch that smelled damp, and a fireplace with a pile of wood stacked beside it. There was a tiny kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with a sink that coughed brown water before running clear. The walls were thin. I could hear every creak, every shift in the wood. I told myself it was normal for an old place like this. The first night, I barely slept. The forest was loud in a way I wasn't used to. The wind howled through the trees, branches scratched against the roof, and every so often, I swore I heard something moving outside. Probably just animals, I told myself. Still, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle just in case. That helped, but not much. The second day, I explored the area a bit, walking through the trees with a hunting knife strapped to my belt. I didn't go far. The trees were too thick, and after a while, I realized I wasn't even sure I'd be able to find my way back without following my own footprints. That was enough exploring for me. I went back to the cabin and spent the rest of the day reading an old book I had brought, the kind with yellowed pages and a cracked spine. It was the only thing that kept me from focusing too much on the noises outside. The second night, something changed. I woke up in the dark, my skin cold with sweat. It wasn't a sound that woke me up. It was a feeling, something deep in my gut telling me I wasn't alone. I lay still, breathing slow, listening. The wind had died down. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the porch outside. I held my breath. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Someone was out there. The footsteps stopped at the door. I could hear them shifting slightly, the wooden planks creaking under their weight. I reached for the knife beside my bed, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. The door didn't open. The lock held. The chair was still wedged against the handle, but the presence outside didn't leave. I lay there for what felt like hours, my muscles tight, my eyes locked on the faint outline of the door. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was slipping through the grimy window. The chair was still against the door. The lock was still in place. But when I stepped onto the porch, I saw them. Footprints. Clear, deep impressions in the mud. Bare feet. I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night. As I stuffed my bag, I heard something outside. A rustling, the crunch of leaves. I turned to the window, expecting to see an animal. A deer, maybe. Instead, I saw movement between the trees. A figure, tall, standing still, watching. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see details, just the shape of a person, half hidden in the shadows. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and ran for my car. The mud was slick, my boots slipping as I reached the driver's side. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I glanced back at the trees. The figure was gone. The car engine roared to life, and I tore down the dirt road, branches scraping the sides as I went. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, until the trees weren't so thick, until the cabin was far behind me. I never looked back.